What's up, ladies and gentlemen, how's it going? It's Dan here from CryoNoir, and I've got a slightly different type of video today. I've never been overly consistent with the presentation or topics on this channel. I do reviews, devlogs, tutorials, streams of consciousness, retro collecting vlogs, and generally just do whatever I want with this channel. Well, today I want to talk about something that happened the other day that not enough people are talking about. A truly momentous event happened in gaming history, and the type of thing that only happens once or so every decade, and it's a shift, a change, a new high watermark. However, because of a number of factors which I will discuss in this video, this event has passed by mostly unreported, and with very little fanfare. A few articles have been written about it in a couple of magazines, and there's been maybe 4 or 5 videos on YouTube from varying different tech channels, but nowhere near the level of conversation that it deserves. Well, now there are going to be 6 videos about it on YouTube. Real-time ray tracing and path tracing are the biggest thing to happen in gaming since the 5th generation of consoles. Not since the original PlayStation and N64 showed us that 3D polygon-based games were the future has there been such a monumental change in approach. The change is such a step forward, it has taken hardware developers nearly 25 years to get to the next evolutionary step. And because of Nvidia's mishandling of the 20 series GPU launch and DICE's lackluster implementation in Battlefield 5, what should have been an amazing moment just became another meme. Now allow me to explain why ray tracing is so important. Just bear with me. Back in the olden times, computational power was so limited that having a moving image on the screen at any one time with more than 2 or 3 colours was like something that was like really hard to achieve. Then computational power increased, and so did the number of colours and the number of pixels that a system could draw at once. Improvements continued to be made through the late 70s and into the 80s and the early 90s. However, 2D sprites had their limitations. People hungered for the third dimension. Polygonal games have been around for almost as long as sprites, with like the 1980s Battlezone being credited as one of the very first, which used vector-based line graphs to give like the illusion of a 3D world. But the home gaming hardware at the time was not up to the job of creating believable worlds. Due to the massive amount of processing power, or so it seemed at the time, that was required to render hundreds of polygons at real time, every advancement in hardware made small improvements in 3D games but massive leaps in the pixel art world. However, there is always a tipping point. In the business and tech world, there is a concept called the S-curve. A new technology comes out and developmental improvements are slow at first, but then really start to take off with massive gains over a very short period of time. Over time, this then sort of slows down, and more time and effort is required by development to generate smaller and smaller amounts of improvement. During the ascent of the previous technology, that a new technology will come out and start to be developed, and then that will have its own S-curve which will then outstrip the old one. This last occurred in gaming around about the mid-90s, and there are 2 titles that kind of really exemplify it that were both released by the same company but just 2 years apart from each other. id Tech's 1994 behemoth Doom pushed 2D sprite work further than anyone had possibly imagined. Although it does give the illusion of being a 3D game, it was only a 2D game using 2D sprites. But then in 1996, just 2 years later, id released Quake. Now, Quake was a huge leap forward, and it ushered a new era in of polygonal games that has been the mainstay right up until this day. The fundamental problem with both Quake and modern 3D games, however, is not the fact that they're based with using 3D polygons themselves, it's the way that those polygons are rendered. Rasterization takes points from each polygon and then projects them towards the screen to create a 2D representation of a 3D object. The technology works fine to an extent, and modern graphics cards have become very fast at performing these calculations. But problems occur when dealing with light interactions with these objects. Like, objects cast shadows on both themselves and on other objects, and some objects are reflective and others are not. Some light sources move and others don't, and some things move around lights, and it's very complicated. To represent this in games, developers have used things like light maps and processes called like ambient occlusion, and these effectively just paint shadows onto the geometry, and they're not real representations of actual light interactions. And this is how it has been done since the very early days of 3D games. From the dithered shadows in Daytona, USA, to the amazing visuals of today. As geometry and scene complexity have both increased, so too has the amount of manpower that's required to do this process and to create the light maps and to paint them and to make them look amazing. And we're now at the point, or have been for a while, where the amount of time and effort that's going in is producing diminishing returns, and games are looking slightly better than the previous generations, but you can sort of see that there's a real slowdown in that quality. Does that all sound familiar using the old SCurve we talked about earlier? Now, if only there was like a way that we could kind of offload all of that manpower and all of that work that's done by the designers to the actual computer itself. Up steps ray tracing. Ray tracing works in almost the opposite way as rasterization. Instead of the geometry firing data of its whereabouts to the camera fires rays out into the environment that then bounce off the geometry and towards the nearest light source. If the ray then hits another object on its way to the light source, it knows that the previous impact point would therefore be in shadow. Path tracing takes this one step further by bouncing rays on and on and on until they hit the light source. Each time it bounces, it takes a log about where it's been and where it's going to, and then works out how the light would then affect that path. Now, this technique, as you might imagine, is very effective for depicting both how shadows and reflections would work in the real world. But it's at a cost, and that cost is very, very computationally heavy. Now, this technology is nothing new though. It's been the mainstay of the visual effects and the CGI industry for years. However, the advantage that they have is that everything for them is pre-rendered. They could set up the computer running all the calculations for these ray bouncings, and then they would go off for a brew, or in some cases they would go home to bed and then come back the next morning, all the calculations were done and the scene would look amazing. Doing all of these calculations in a split second is inconceivable, let alone doing them at 60 plus times per second as you would expect as a baseline for modern games. Then up steps Nvidia with their new RTX Turing graphics cards, with the new Tensor cores designed specifically for real-time ray tracing operations. Now, this should have been a huge moment. It should have been the next step. Processes that would normally take hours and hours to perform were now being done in milliseconds. Due to Nvidia's history of being less than honest when talking about their products, GTX 970, and the practices for price gouging on new cards for modest gains, the tech media was rightly skeptical. Then the initial benchmarks and pricing came out, and everyone's skepticism was proven right. We got modest gains for a chunky price hike. I mean, hell, it wasn't even as big a generational leap as there had been from the 9 series to the 10 series, but all that was still in standard rasterization. As soon as all the new ray tracing goodness was on show, it would all be worthwhile, and at launch, there was nothing. Quite literally not one game supported ray tracing. We had to wait a full month for Battlefield 5 to come out, and when it did, it only implemented ray tracing on reflections, and at a catastrophic cost to performance. To maintain a minimum 60 FPS frame rate, you'd have to cut the resolution not just in half, but down to a quarter. And all that just to add real-time reflections to puddles and improve some reflective flaws. So at that point the memes began. I suppose it would have helped if Battlefield 5 had actually been a good game in the first place, but what with other controversies surrounding the game, it really looked like ray tracing was dead. Now, I bought an RTX 2070 as an upgrade from my old GTX 980, and ray tracing was not really the reason why I bought it. I had concerns that the 980's 4GB frame buffer would not really be enough for a certain Cyberpunk title that I've been waiting for years, and as the 2070 was kind of fractionally more powerful than a 1080 but for less money here in the UK, it seemed like the right time to upgrade. I mean, most gamers I know generally upgrade every sort of other generation because by that point the price to performance increase kind of makes a little bit of sense. Plus, you know, ray tracing, I mean, maybe it was going to be a thing. So what was the huge thing that happened the other day? The thing that launched this meandering history into game rendering technologies? Well, I give you Quake 2.
It begins from you.
Here you have the world's first real-time path-traced game. And it wasn't a big AAA studio that developed it, it was a modder called Christopher Sheed who tore out all of the light maps, the shadow maps, the shader profiles and all the rasterization rendering, everything, and then managed to implement not only real-time ray tracing, but real-time path tracing for everything, and got it running at 60 FPS on an entry-level 20 series card. It's quite fitting that Quake was one of the big breakthrough fully polygon-based first-person shooters, and now the sequel is the first game to break another boundary. Many of you, including my fellow retro collecting addict Rob, might say something along the lines of, well, Quake 2 is fuck old, what's the big whoop? Well, first thing, I mean, this isn't even a ray traced game, this is a path traced game, which is even more computationally heavy than ray tracing. And secondly, the texture quality and the geometric complexity doesn't really affect performance with this rendering method. All these models and textures could be improved massively, and the game would run exactly the same as it does. Biggest overhead is the number of light scatter computations and the number of light sources. Now, the number of light scatter events doesn't depend on scene complexity, and Quake 2 actually has an awful lot of light sources in, almost as many as a modern game. So this method could work on even the most impressive of modern titles, and you would still get reasonable returns. You just happen to use Quake 2 due to the fact that the engine is open source and there's already a massive modding community for it. I mean, this mod has shown what neither Nvidia or DICE could. Real-time ray tracing is here, and it's going to change gaming as we know it. Okay, thank you very much for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed that video. In the description below, there'll be a link to Andrei Lebrov's channel. Now, he had the that was where I sort of lifted, shall we say, all the footage for the ray tracing and ray casting and everything. So go check out his channel, show him some love, and yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. Our ray tracing is looking really good. Okay, I get it. There's a way to go yet, but seriously, this is a huge deal. This is a huge deal. But anyway, thank you very much for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please hit the like, the comment, and the subscribe, and do all that good stuff. And thank you very much, and I'll see you very soon. Alright, take it easy. Bye-bye.